Hi, and welcome. This is the Center for Social and Ethical Concerns podcast with Malloy University. I'm your host, Jennifer Scuro, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. This episode is Disability Bioethics as the Future of Bioethics. Joining me is Joel Michael Reynolds, an Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University. He's the Senior Research Scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, the Senior Bioethics Advisor to and Fellow of the Hastings Center, and Faculty Scholar of the Greenwall Foundation. Desiree Valentine is an Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Marquette University and is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Faculty Fellow for the 2022-2023 academic year. And joining me is my colleague, Kimberly S. Engels, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Malloy University.
I'm very excited about where disability bioethics is right now. And part of the reason for my excitement is twofold. One has to do with how the response to COVID played out, especially during the initial months. There's a lot going on, so I understand if people weren't paying attention to what I'm about to say, but within those first, say, 4 to 8 weeks, you had a whole bunch of, especially state legislatures, scrambling to come up with various sorts of protocols for the crises. You had hospital systems, many of whom did already have kind of triage level stuff on the books, but nothing for this scale of a problem. And a lot of the white papers, gray papers, and official policies that came out were just like explicitly ableist in all sorts of ways, including things that were as egregious as like someone with intellectual disabilities will not get access to ventilator use, and they don't even give a reason why. They would just, say stuff like this. And the initial response from the bioethics community was fast and vociferous in support of equity of care for disabled people. Like all sorts of bioethicists who I don't think have ever considered themselves disability bioethicists, haven't even done research on it, were, publishing left and right, talking to the appropriate stakeholders, were saying, you cannot do this, besides the fact that A, it's illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. B, this is just a flawed understanding of justice and equity as applied to crisis standards of care. And I was really, despite the terror of everything that was going on in that moment, I was very happy to see the speed of the pushback, to see how many bioethicists were standing up for disabled people. And also, I should add, this was not just in the US. So within, oh my gosh, it must have been 5 or 6 weeks after COVID started, you had the United Nations coming out with a paper saying, hey, don't forget the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Just because this is a crisis doesn't mean we shift into utilitarian mode where the already quote unquote healthy, able-bodied people matter more. Like, what the hell are you doing? So there were just many levels at which I was encouraged to see that sort of a response. Now, there's still a ton of work to be done. And I still think there is this idea, for example, that disability bioethics is just like one kind of sub field within bioethics. And of course, the way I see it, and I think this is true also of Christine Wiesler, who we both edited the Disability Bioethics Reader, we actually think that disability bioethics is a framework shift, a perspective shift for all of bioethics. And I would like a world in which what we're calling disability bioethics just becomes how bioethics is done. And the way we define disability bioethics is simple, but it's pretty radical. It's saying when we engage in bioethical inquiry, in the broadest sense of that term, we should center the experiences of people with disabilities. We should center their testimony, we should center research about their experiences, and we should also center research coming from the now almost 60 years of research in disability studies, right, which is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field that includes everything across the humanities and social sciences. We should also be centering research in, as a part of that, philosophy of disability. And the argument for why we should do that is quite simple, but all of bioethics is ultimately about disability in some way or another. Just full stop. Pick a topic. I can explain to you how there is a way in which that's actually about disability, and that involving the testimony and the experiences and research concerning people with disabilities is only going to be a boon. In many cases, I think it's actually going to just be a better framework for the sorts of ethical, legal, social implications that arise, whatever the topic might be, whether it's clinical care in the ICU, whether it's patient-provider communication for a transplant surgeon, whether it's thinking about administration level policies for a hospital system, whatever it is, or thinking about debates, really more speculative debates about long-term impacts on the bios. Bioethics, of course, is much wider than merely medical, and certainly wider than merely clinical concerns these days. This idea that flourishing can happen if environments are supportive and accessible, I think is one of the most radical political ideas and one of the most transformative ideas ever. Yeah, I had the great joy of working with Eric Perrins at the Hastings Center on this public humanities grant that had 6 events featuring all sorts of disability studies scholars, activists, and thought leaders. And the theme that we came up with communally for this event was the art of flourishing. And the principle behind the event was to say, people can flourish in all sorts of bodies and minds, right? It's a question of supporting an accessible environments.
When we talk about centering disabled lives and disabled experiences, the idea that when we research disability, it's very often still that element of like cure, and a lot of the work in the disability bioethics perspectives, where I feature a lot of your work in my courses on bioethics as a disability bioethics, is this idea that care and cure are different systems and different economies, and that quality of life becomes a focus in research versus, kind of like performance and, kind of like those arcs of like normalcy. Like, this is where most people fit, and we want to move all the people at the margins into like where most people fit, And I think when we talk about that too, then it also includes more people, right? So we're not just featuring disabled people, we're also featuring like fat people in that framework without it having to be named in that same kind of way. And again, what quality of life care and quality of life research can do for bioethics, for what bioethics can then do for those professionals working in the field, then we can also level out the conversation about that labor, about the work, about the anxieties and fears that come with it, the real burdensomeness of what we think of when we associate it with like things like disability.
So my name is Desiree Valentine. I have a dual title degree in philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies. I'm currently an assistant professor of philosophy at Marquette University, on leave this year as a faculty fellow at Princeton's Center for Human Values. And so a little bit about my background in philosophy, in the humanities in general. At base, I really see myself as an interdisciplinary scholar. So my research is firmly rooted in fields like critical race studies, bioethics, women's studies, critical disability theory. And I guess some of my key motivating concerns or questions revolves around examining the intersection of race and disability, ultimately aiming to disrupt the ways in which both tend to be, one, naturalized as like biological or social markers that adhere in the individual, and then two, like disrupting the ways in which both also tend to be understood as discrete historical and political phenomena. So my work aims to develop different conceptual paradigms for understanding what I identify as the co-constitution of race and disability, specifically through intertwining systems of ableism and racism. And so I take, a deep historical approach to those questions, a deep socio-political interest in context. So whether that's national, international context, that's how my work is motivated. And those are the questions that I seek to answer.
So my name is Kimberly Ingalls. I work on, so in terms of bioethics, my area of interest has always been existential medicine, kind of using existentialism and phenomenology as tools for understanding the experience of healthcare, but also just the experience of health in modern society. Part of existential medicine is rejecting the over-reliance of biological naturalism in medicine, and this idea that every illness is traceable to some type of biological pathology in the body. And so part of existentialism and phenomenology, using that as a tool, is rejecting that notion and understanding illness kind of as emerging as a combination of biological, emotional, cultural, social factors that contribute to the experience of illness in the modern world. In terms of disability bioethics, I also have developed, I came to bioethics through that lens. I've developed also an interest in indigenous philosophy and kind of indigenous approaches to thinking about health and the relationship between mind and body. And both of these lenses influence how I think about disability in relation to bioethics, and the ways that disability essentially emerges or is created through these multiple, as I said, combinations of biological factors, but also cultural factors, also social factors, also capitalist structures that arrange things in certain way, produce certain categories of certain standards for normality and abnormality, and then disability emerges through that. And I've been really interested lately, in the understanding that many forms of neurodivergence that today we classify as disability, for Indigenous people, those forms of neurodivergence were often seen as gifts, spiritual connections to the spiritual realm that other people didn't have. And it's only in our modern context that these things have emerged and now are classified as disabilities, because they are disabling in modern society, but they weren't always that way. And so just understanding this ways that categories not only of disability but disease in general are created through this combination of factors. That's what kind of drives my interest in bioethics in general, and also my interest in disability in relation to bioethics.
So yeah, thank you for that, because I think when we think about the concept of a disability bioethics, and that's something that I think in my work I'm advocating for, and I think generally why I'm imagining us having to really require almost like a conversation that advocates for changing the direction of bioethics, because so much of bioethics literature and history is dominated by a very particular kind of narrative, and it's a whitewash narrative, and it's really hard to find ways to counter narrate or to give venue to counter narratives that have equal very powerful standing to be translated into practices. Because I think that's the big gap, is as much as bioethics has its theory arm and has a variety of different academics, interdisciplinary academics working in it, translating that into the field and having professionals really utilize the tools in their techniques, in the creation of their, professional communities, that I think there's a pipeline that exists, and that doesn't include a lot of this really diverse work of disruption, because professionals especially in medicine, but any of the therapeutics, and to the degree to which disability bioethics is a larger idea of what counts as bioethical, there's so much room for us to integrate the disruption in a really meaningful and like a change in trajectory kind of way. So the future of bioethics, this is why the title's this way, is it's such a powerful academic activity, and a lot of labor goes into the work of disruption, because I think in academia we tend to be very conservative. So academic bioethics, like a lot of academic philosophy, that's why I love that you said right away, I think we do this too. I do it. I'm a philosopher by training, but in a lot of ways it's hard to identify as a philosopher, because it is populated by a lot of very familiar voices with the very familiar interests, and I think some of the battles within philosophy and even the battles within bioethics have lost their charm for me, because it really isn't very radical and it isn't doing anything very revolutionary. So, and again, this is why also I love the work that you're doing, and why I gravitated toward having you talk a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about the work you worked on and the work you're working on? Because I've used your work in my bioethics classes. I'm just going to say that a little.
Thanks. So I would say that my approach is really one of conceptual experimentation. So like I said, my intervention is attempting to change paradigms around how we understand the concepts of race and disability and their intersection, how we understand their history, their socio-political background, the context in which they're given expression. And so I think part of my work as a trained philosopher is really this sort of diagnostic element of saying, these are concepts that we need to think about and understand much better. We need to do a lot of that work to reorient ourselves to history, really. And so part of my past work has involved work in reproduction, so assisted reproductive technologies. It's involved work at the intersections of race and disability in law and legal philosophy. And it's involved looking at the medical sphere and thinking about healthcare pedagogy and what it would mean to have a more fuller understanding of the relationship between race and disability as social systems, as processes, rather than, like I said, elements that inherit individual bodies that are located in biological entities or structures of individuals. And so those works really are focused on, like I said, understanding processes of racialization and disablement. So what do these processes do? What do they bring to life? What do they animate? How do they organize populations for abandonment or neglect? How do they lend support to certain economic orders? And so, like I said, all of these questions are operating in my work. And so in a piece that I wrote, Technologies of Reproduction, which I think you've mentioned before as teaching in your class, and I'd love to hear how that has gone, because I mean, writing is really, you get so much out of it when you hear about how people have taken it up. And yeah. So anyways, in this piece, I talk about how we think of race and disability as just status outcomes of the reproduction process. Like you birth a child with a race or a potential disability or non-disability or certain ability status. But I wanted to think about how race and disability could themselves be understood as productive, in the sense of producing forms of social relation themselves, forms of understanding that that could help us better understand what's going on in the assisted reproductive arena. Because, I mean, folks go into these experiences and have opportunities to kind of, the sort of transparent notion of choice is really central and important here. And so a lot of times that choice operates amidst the backdrop of our social norms, habits, values that are often unquestioned in relation to disability and race, or sort of the assumed status of those things. So in that piece, I look at how race and disability actually operate, how they function. And then in other pieces, similarly, I think about how we might use a concept that I propose, like racialized disablement, to forge a confrontation between the terms race and disability, to think about how they're so very intertwined historically, politically. So we can think here of like histories of medical diagnoses being used to justify the continuance of slavery. So drapetomania, or any of the work by Samuel Cartwright, or how schizophrenia evolved as a disease that was attached to Black men as they resisted oppression during the civil rights arena, or using percentage of white blood to identify mental fitness when it came to determining Native people's land allotments with the Dawes Act. So all of these things, I wanted to have a concept that would help us think about how practices of racialization and disablement function in tandem and can never be fully unentangled, let's say. And so again, like the emphasis on history, and particularly the violences of slavery and colonialism, immigration abuses, lynching, Jim Crow, medical experimentation, and captivity, all of these things I wanted to think about as they relate to disability, whether that's inflicting literal disability on populations, pathologizing Black and Brown people, and producing ongoing disabling environments, whether that's related to like resource deprivation or police brutality, geographic segregation. I want to use the lens of disability and disablement to think about processes of racialization and vice versa.
If you're coming to bioethics from a standpoint of, okay, people get diagnosed with these diseases, and then, people come to us with these sets of values, and these particular situations might emerge in a healthcare context. And what bioethics is these set of moral principles that kind of help us unpack what to do in these scenarios that emerge in these contexts. Sure, that's one dimension of bioethics. But then the philosophers over here are also questioning, well, what do you mean by disease? What do you mean by a diagnosis? A lot of things that, a more straightforward traditional bioethics would just accept as like a fact or a pre-given, the philosopher is going to call into question, like you said, what is the definition of harm? What is the definition of choice? What does it even mean to choose? Calling into question, I think, a lot of assumptions in medical practice. And part of that reason is some of these assumptions are very deeply embedded, not just in Western medicine, but Western science and, our society in general. It's built upon a foundation of assumptions, some of which are more stable than others. And, the philosopher wants to pick at that foundation and see places where it's not as stable as it's often marketed or it's often believed to be. And so, yeah, those tensions can certainly emerge. When we're teaching bioethics, we teach a lot of nurses at Malloy, and a lot of them come in with a certain set of assumptions. And so when I'm teaching bioethics to them, one of my goals is to try to help dislodge some of those assumptions or just challenge them a little bit. Getting them to think about even just the definition of disability, what is disability? That's a question that many of them, some of them actually, I think a lot of times haven't even thought much about it, but the idea that, disability is inherent, it's just something that is, you're either disabled or you're not. And it's not something that is, part of a social and cultural web that hasn't occurred to most of them. And so trying to help dislodge that, helping them understand, ways that, the healthcare system has been built, or even thinking of the ways that, whiteness has kind of been introduced as a standard for healthcare. And, a lot of our medical norms are built around or structured around like white bodies and also white cultural norms, or, European cultural norms, that are presented as just, universals. So helping them see that as well, calling that into question. In the way that, we think about even medical ethics is often, it's very European influence, where, we have Kantian influence, we have utilitarian influence. Those are what, influence the basic, the 4 core biomedical ethical principles. Challenging kind of those foundations. Autonomy is one of the foundational principles, but that principle of autonomy is very much based on kind of the Western conception of self, with the strong focus on the individual, where others might come to it with a different, a more familial sense of self, or a more community sense of self, or a more tribal sense of self, where autonomy might look very different. But we have, a very narrow lens in straightforward traditional bioethics of what autonomy means.
People can flourish in all sorts of bodies and minds, and it is up to us to organize society in such a way that all sorts of bodies and minds can flourish. We could do it. We could do it. This is not written in stone that we have to have this capitalistic profit above people, greed before all else system. We could change this. I mean, one thing I am worried about, this is not remotely my idea, and I'm going to here quote my brilliant colleague, Olufemi Taiwo. He just had this book come out with Haymarket called Elite Capture, based on an article of the same name that came out a few years ago in Boston Review. And there is a very serious concern that the more kind of radical progressive elements that could push us towards a more just society will just be captured by the powers that be and then be subsumed into the status quo. And this is, I think, as big of a worry for disability justice as it is for all sort of environmental efforts, where greenwashing is like a very, very big, serious problem. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, and I think Femi would agree, there's no silver bullet to this. It's just about, this comes down to action, whether or not a DEI initiative from some organization actually brings about change, or ends up being lip service to say that, oh yeah, we care about diversity. At the end of the day, that's going to turn on those who are doing the work or those who are not, and the very downstream fights. And I'm not, I think it's way too easy to just be cynical and say, oh, all the DEI stuff is not actually whatever, or, oh yeah, there's more disability bioethics, but they're just reinforcing whatever, some sort of very large scale problematic model of medicine or something like that. I think that cynical kind of move is just, well, first of all, it's self-defeating. But second of all, I just don't understand that, like, this is how change happens. Like, unless you burn everything down and start over, you have to get in there and you got to do the work to try and change it. And I don't buy this. You either can be a reformer or you have to have a Molotov. I think you can be both, and it depends on the time of day, and it depends on what precisely is happening and where you are and the sort of organizing you can or cannot do. It's more complicated than that.
I mean, I think in bioethics, choice making, the concepts like autonomy and informed consent. If we, look at the dominant narrative of what bioethics is intending to do in preserving these concepts, and then we look at the history and the kind of like, counter narratives of how strangely concocted some of those concepts have been, and what they even mean, I think that's where it's hard to keep reteaching bioethics without really feeling like at the same time you're like, but you really should also be reading and looking at this, right? It's really hard to kind of stick to the canon of what's considered a bioethics, and which is why I do introduce your work into my intro classes, because I think there is an immediacy in really bringing the historical phenomenon of violence into contemporary contexts where a lot of bioethics might be, thought labs on different kind of scenarios. And those I find really exhausting, because the scenarios tend to really kind of reproduce the same kind of fiction about autonomy and choice. And again, disabled advocates have been saying that for years, that for the most part, a lot of medicine or service professions are always something about them without them, and never nothing about us without us. So that's why I really do love the kind of like really leaning in on that idea, like even a concept like choice, which I think is really always a good, and it's super benign, and it's really important, and we might feel like we're really committed to that concept as a value laden concept. It's really got such baggage.
Yeah, I mean, it's always rooted in it's always rooted in context, etc. And I mean, referencing just the few principles of bioethics that you did, I mean, justice is what always gets put to the wayside. And to follow up, justice is central in the work that I do, thinking about different paradigms of justice, whether that's reparative justice, reproductive justice, disability justice, racial justice, family justice. These are all intimately related and should be at the site of bioethics, right? A critical disability centered bioethics.
When it comes to bioethics, and especially from a critical disability lens, we kind of want to be really careful about what kind of case studies we use and how we think through them, and how we use them as a tool of analysis. And then maybe talking about like how we use our maybe moral imagination or case studies to think through questions of bioethics, and what's the limitations. What have you found really exciting, and what have you found really limiting about that?
I mean, so that kind of highlights a perennial tension in just the field of ethics, this idea of the abstract versus the concrete. A thought experiment can be useful sometimes to tease out, something like the difference between the nature of the act and the result, which is really what, the trolley problem is getting at. That can be useful, but that leaves us at the level of the abstract. And so that's kind of a conflict in ethics that's been seen between, for example, deontology, utilitarianism, like that abstract reasoning, where you can just pose a scenario and then just, use the abstract principles to solve it. Where things like virtue theory and care ethics, are much more about the situation, and, there aren't necessarily moral absolutes, and you have to look at the specific context and the social and cultural factors at play. And indigenous ethics is like that as well. Indigenous ethics is very focused on the particular. They don't have abstract universals, because everything for them is tied not only to a specific social context, but a specific physical place. And so this whole idea of, just doing ethics as like, is it moral to, steal medicine to save your family member or something like that? Okay, that might help us test a moral intuition sometimes, but a lot of ethical issues are far more complicated than that, and they take place, in a social, cultural, material context with a variety of, a variety of variables, a variety of personalities, a variety of interests, a variety of conflicting cultural values. All of these things are what the actual moral realm is like. And so a robust bioethics or just a robust ethics in general has to move beyond thought experiments. Question all of it, right? Question, or when philosophy is working as it should, question these foundational concepts that we're using to even start thinking about these issues.
I think, well, to just validate what you're saying, and I don't think it's very off track at all. I think this is what happens when we come at it with a critical lens is once you crack the nut, you get all these things that kind of spill over into kind of larger, more global concerns. And I think when bioethics becomes such a subfield under things like medicine, a lot of those essential assumptions, when we jostle them, really become this kind of, this like underwriting of a lot of the conflicts that might occur in isolation, in experiential or professional isolation. But when you do that, and I think a lot about like how COVID has really done that, right? So COVID's done some of the work for us philosophers in, you use the word dislodge. I use jostle. We jostling a little thing, because I think too, when it gets disruptive, people get very defensive and protective over certain biases and certain assumptions, right? Because it's familiar and, the devil. So I think COVID did a lot in kind of opening up discussions about things like food pathways, things that I think people in medicine wouldn't necessarily be concerned with. But when you think about things like what malnutrition looks like in relation then to COVID, in relation then to recovery from, sickness and disease, right? Or vulnerability to sickness and disease for that matter. What populations are affected, sometimes that lens is very insightful for a professional, but for a philosophical viewpoint, it's kind of baked into the bread of what systemic racism looks like, right? So systemic racism makes certain populations vulnerable for certain kinds of issues of things like, malnutrition, which creates vulnerability and vulnerable, and again, malnutrition, I think when we talk about things like even the obesity crisis, from a disabled perspective and a disability perspective, the obesity crisis or epidemic, that language is ineffective. It becomes really kind of actually quite harmful to people who really struggle at the margins to maintain a body mind that, gives them place in the world. When it becomes this like either we're reforming or we're burning everything to the ground, starting over, some kind of like big revolutionary act, I think what they forget for a lot of us who occupy spaces that are kind of like in desperate need of, some kind of alteration, we're also watching the walls rot. I mean, that's the thing, is that like at some point, maybe we really do need to like bulldoze the house if the house has gotten really rotten. And so that's always what I'm looking for is like, where's the rot in the system that seems to be undoing whatever we're doing to polish the, furniture. It's not going to make any difference because the walls are coming down, So it is really, for me, I think a very reasonable way to connect a lot of ways in which I think the university, higher ed could be this site of that conversation. Like, to what degree is it a question of reform, or is it a question of, completely starting over or paradigm shifts, in the sense of like when we have to be honest about the rot, when things are really fail. And again, when systems fail, people die. And in disability bioethics, we know that first and foremost. And that's where I think disability bioethics has a leadership position. In your own work, the thing I was thinking of was, you say this, this is in The Life Worth Living, and you talk about three general structures of the lived experience of disability: attentional reconfiguration, personal and social reconfiguration, and horizontal reconfiguration. Put simply, you say disability reshapes the salience and meaning of objects of attention at the level of the personal, the social, and political. And you use phenomenology to do some of this work, but I really find this and you do this too with your piece about is it your grandfather, where you talk about like layering how we might use a tool of phenomenology to kind of, in a very practical way, organize how we are related to things and use those as like almost like moods or registers.
So the book is structured to analyze the ableist conflation of experiences of disability with experiences of pain and suffering. And what I try and do is this kind of multi-step process of like, okay, well, let's look at, I mean, it's almost Aristotelian in the sense of like, what do people say about X? Does that actually correlate with the experience of X or what X actually is? This is the movement in the Nicomachean Ethics. Not that we have to bring up Aristotle to make this point. That is part of what I'm doing. So I talk about theories of pain, and then I contrast the theories with the phenomenology of pain, where I'm specifically grounding that phenomenology in the experience of someone with complex regional pain syndrome. Then I talk about theories of disability, and then I talk about disability through the experience of someone with degenerative multiple sclerosis. And I'm very careful to note, this is not going to be a phenomenology of disability full stop. I don't think that's possible. This is a phenomenology, and I chose a non-congenital disability, and one that was not simply degenerative in the sense that the disease progression never stops in the case of MS with its effect on the central nervous system, but also there's a lot of variation, a whole ton of variation in how one's going to experience the world. With MS, you know, you can wake up one day and just not see for the next couple of weeks, and then your sight comes back, and there's a lot of disorientation that occurs. And I chose that example because I wanted to take an example of a disability that does have constitutively negative aspects to it, right? There are difficulties associated with MS that just are not necessarily true of certain types of disabilities where the difficulty is not intrinsic to the quote unquote condition. And I wanted to say, okay, well, even in this case, what do we see similarities with the structure of pain and suffering? And then the punchline of the book in the last two chapters to be like, no, even though of course, there are certain types of disabilities that do come along with pain and suffering. And of course, I define exactly what I mean by that in a lot more detail. That is not true on the whole, right? Those cases are exceptional, both statistically exceptional, but also just exceptional in terms of how we should think about disability as a general category. And then the kind of big hit at the end is to say the reason we would have ever made this sort of mistake, conflating disability with pain, suffering, disadvantage, all this stuff, is because our understanding of what it is to be able, our understanding of ability is messed up. It's ableist, to put it in a bumper sticker form. We think of ability as something that resides inside of our bodies or inside of whatever our I is, and that's just metaphysically there's no defensible way of understanding ability in that manner, because ability is a relation. Ability, the phenomenon of ability, is an interaction between an object and other objects in a setting, in an environment. And there I'm drawing, I don't do it a ton in the book, but really I'm just drawing on ecological psychology, work of people like J.J. Gibson in the 70s forward. Interestingly, that argument, you can find that argument in lots of spaces. You can find it in evolutionary biology when you're thinking about organism-environment interaction, whether at the species level or not. You find it in something like ecological psychology. You even find it in philosophy of action, which is a much more narrow pocket of research, but you'll get people like Barbara Vetter being like, yeah, really doesn't make sense to think of abilities as characteristic of individuals when you think about it. Anyway, to go back to that chapter 4, those general structures that I talk about, I'm really just drawing on S.K. Tombs' work. I try and make that very clear that, you know, that in my view, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the first disabled phenomenologist and phenomenology of disability, both at the same time, are S.K. Toombs's work from 91, 92 forward. And so I wanted to foreground her research, but also I do think that those general structures that are identified, the reconfiguration of social, political, personal, and also horizontal in the Heideggerian sense, those are going to be true, I think, for almost all experiences of disability, even when one is born with a condition, because there the reconfiguration is coming not so much because of necessarily changes inside of one's relationship to one's own body, insofar as we can heuristically determine that, but because of bumping into an ableist world.
There's no way that we're just dismantling a system and then building up a new one that's not, related to, we're living, this is like a living history. And so I think I try and in my classes really say, you are living history right now. This is not something just of the past. We can do the work of tracing the violences of slavery to today. And we can show the very clear linkages. And once that's made present to folks, it's a hard pill to swallow, right? Like it's a hard thing to face. But I do think centering yourself as a dynamic participant in your historic period and social world is also empowering. Like it's empowering to have that sort of ownership and accountability and responsibility to think about how your position within this milieu is shaped, and you can take part in shaping what comes out of that, right? What comes next. So it's this hard thing to negotiate as a teacher when you are saying things that take a lot of unlearning. But in the process, like you also want to have safe ground in which to pursue and further curiosities, right? So it's this grounding and ungrounding experience that students and anyone who continues the sort of life of the mind or interested in the experience of learning genuinely will undergo. And it's hard, but it's also exciting. So I try and make that very apparent too to students. Yeah.
It's a lot of risk management so that they could be able to shoulder the risk once they're actually out in the field working. Once they're done with the learning part of their, professional life, right? When they're still studying and observing and trying to pick up on how to do it. I think there is that process of allowing them to imagine that the risk taking is manageable enough to be able to become advocates. And I do find that one of the shortcuts to the unlearning part of it is actually drawing from their own experiences. That a lot of them, and this is something we do in disability, critical disability work, is I think it's as soon as you start looking for disability, it's everywhere. But if you ask somebody about their experience of disability, very often you do get people thinking like, oh, I don't really know anything about disability. And the unpacking experiences and really reflecting on them, examining them, treating the students as credible knowers and not just as these kind of clean slate people who are going to be professionals, right? So like just these kind of green kids going into a profession that they think is going to be a bit of a rescue for whatever it is that they want to do, right? Because I think service professionals, especially at the student level, they really just want to help people, which is very noble, but very often it sabotages that the unlearning is in that too, is that you can turn whole communities into help projects. I think even something like telling my students to stop talking about the poor, like what is that? Is that people? Is that like a blob of, how do you begin to get them to see that, like, for good intention, the harm is built into that conceptual, commitment you've made, and having them get curious about that. But that's the hard part.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how like experience informs your like academic pursuits and vice versa, I think that also, I mean, just personally having delved into disability bioethics over the last, 5 to 10 years, I have had to like rethink my own experiences, across my life, across, history and my, descendants, etc., and rethink like, oh, it wasn't just the case that like my grandmother had tuberculosis as like some, random natural thing that happened, but we could situate that in a social and political sphere that, as a racialized woman living at a certain time with a lack of certain protections and care, like that fundamentally altered her life in ways. And I mean, tying that to our present when we're thinking about connections between Blackness and breathing, breath, like it helps you reorient yourself to, I think, to experience, to your own histories in ways that are illuminating and both troubling and empowering to have a revision of your experiences in history.
And now we continue our conversation about disability bioethics as the future of bioethics.
Disability justice is just straight up connecting people who are already part of the struggle, and creating community and creating, that's so crucial. But more of it needs to be done, especially because of the history of forcing disabled people and disabled communities into the margins and literally into the shadows in certain circumstances. The last 2 years, I've been doing a lot more talks in med schools, and I'm a pessimist by nature, so the fact that I'm saying another thing that's slightly hopeful is a little bit unusual. But I have been very pleased to see in lots of different sorts of medical education spaces where I'll come in there and I'll talk about disability, and the fact that my framework is completely not, oh, how do we not make people disabled, or my framework is from the start, it's how do we just improve equity and quality of care for disabled patients. And especially the younger students, I'm not talking about necessarily those who are in residency or continuing medical education, but first or second years, they're already on board with that. Most of them, it seems. They already have at least a somewhat, even if it's a little bit incipient, they have a somewhat critical attitude towards my only job is cure. And that already, I'm like, wow, this is progress. Like I would have never imagined that in the aughts or the 90s as a kind of general framework. And so I see a glimmer of hope there. And where I don't see the hope and where it does get extremely frustrating is these damn transhumanists, the long-termism, like all of these sorts of the spheres where those debates happen, the eugenic reflex to say, of course, we're fighting for a future where there is no such thing as disability, i.e. there will be no disabled people. That has to just be flipped on its head and fought against tooth and nail. Wanting a future without disabled people should be as offensive and terrifying a thought as saying I want a future without French people or so. This should not fly as a part of discourse. It should terrify people. Disability is central to being human. It is an aspect of the sorts of beings we are. We should want a world in which there are always disabled people of all sorts, and we build the world with that being a good thing. And we want the world to be as accessible and supportive of flourishing for all sorts of bodies and minds.
There's an ever increasing kind of wearing your there's this discourse in modern society of kind of wearing your diagnosis now as a badge, something to be spoken openly about. And there's kind of this psychologizing of discourse of this idea that like everyone is diseased or pathologized in some way. And a lot of people are, promoting it as like a really good thing because now people are being open about their mental health and, we're ending the stigma. And, talking about these things, of course, is important, and ending the stigma for, different forms of neurodivergence is extremely important. But I think it's coming at a cost of now, everybody is now diseased. Everybody is now pathological in some way. And we all start celebrating the ways that we are pathological instead of, again, dislodging these categories of, normality and abnormality to begin with. It's now just, and the more that we transition to using like psychology language as like a modern cultural discourse, I think that it has the potential to have really negative effects, harmful effects in terms of, the way that we think about ourselves and each other. But something that's concerning me at the moment is, younger people who are unable to conform to this for whatever reason, and, then feel themselves as defective and deficient and diseased and pathologized, and how different their experience would be if that were not the expectation for them, that they should have to do this. And how different might their, experience be if they did live in like a nature-based society where they, had freedom from a schedule, where they were able to spend time outside, directly immersed in nature, where they had a feeling as a part of a community, and where their particular way of being in the world, even if it is neurodivergent, was celebrated and understood. Okay, this is what it means to be you. This is how you, relate to things. This is how you relate to, or this is how you experience the world. How different would it be if their condition was celebrated instead of pathologized?
I think that's so important. Another reference I can make, I'm thinking of like Sonora Taylor's Beasts of Burden, where she talks about how the lives of animals and the lives of disabled people have a shared history, and that ableism can be a way in which we can, compartmentalize how maybe the concern for animals is not the same as the concern for disabled people, where she does a really lovely analysis of talking about how there's a root and shared considerability in the way we understand relations, right? That intersubjective quality of being in the world that I think as philosophers who are not committed to utilitarianism can do. And I think that's part of the rub, is that, Singer as a utilitarian and with great platform does harm because his toolkit is so limited. And I think for us, we embrace certain, what we call in the disabled world, frictions, in the ways in which maybe there's a something else that holds these things together that is worth advocating for and giving platform to. And I think this is why we're doing this in the as a podcast discussion, because I think there isn't enough work in saying like there's no either ors when you do really good work in bioethics. But bioethics really does magnetize that either or as if it were effective way to think about things, like you said, to test moral intuitions and moral reasoning. But I honestly think that's going to be the future of bioethics, is to break with that. And I think your work really does that, especially in the way you resource Indigenous ethics to think through problems that are really important, not just for bioethics, but again, what expands the field. So let's talk a little bit about what's most concerning for you right now. What's been kind of like troublesome for you, or things that you're thinking through yourself that you're working on maybe, that you think people should be thinking about as well?
I've become very interested in, what would be called the indigenous worldview. It's also sometimes called the kinship worldview, and how they viewed things that we now classify as mental illness, or we classify them as pathologies, or we classify them as some type of divergence. Because, you know, I actually, you know, I deal with, you know, my own child is not neurotypical. And I sometimes, you know, I think a lot about, you know, how their experience might be different if, you know, they weren't living in what Foucault calls the disciplinary society. So I'll just explain that, you know, for the listener. You know, Foucault argues that, you know, all of our institutions kind of are set up in a way that they produce categories of normality and abnormality. And these categories only emerge through a specific strategies of power and control over, you know, the minute actions, or the everyday kind of minute things of us going about our lives. So, you know, control over our movements, control over space, you know, expectations in school settings that you're supposed to sit in one desk for 8 hours a day, you know, constant observation, what he calls panopticism, the idea that somebody is always kind of watching you, observing you, turning you into a case, establishing categories of what is normal for us to do and what isn't normal. You know, so now, you know, it's understood it's normal for you to start going to school when you're like 3 years old, and to learn to sit in a desk for 8 hours a day, and to, you know, not talk without raising your hand, and to only sit in the ways that they want you to sit. And you can only move in certain ways when you're scheduled to be able to move in those ways. You know, and you're supposed to do that for 12 years plus maybe 14 years. And then you're supposed to do a modified version of that when you're in college. And then you're supposed to do a modified version of that when you go out into the workplace, and then you sit at a desk for 8 to 10 hours a day. And that's what it means to be normal and successful in our society. Well, that's what it means to be normal and successful in capitalist society and the disciplinary society, where, you know, this is kind of reinforced from every angle. And it's not just the school, it's also the hospital, and it's, you know, ultimately the prison system, the psychiatric system. All of it kind of enforces, you know, this is what it means to flourish as a human being in our society, is to be able to do that. And then there's these people who, for various reasons, you know, might be a form of neurodivergence, or just some type of failure to conform, are then, you know, if for some reason they're not able to do that, if they're not able to fit into that standard of, you know, sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day over and over on repeat until you die, you know, if that doesn't, if they can't adapt themselves to that, then they're abnormal, they're deviant in some way, they're defective in some way, they're pathologized in some way. You know, we just have this increasing list of different diagnoses that children can be given, you know, even when they're in school, and the, you know, ever increasing number of ways that just a failure to be able to conform to the standard can be pathologized. And I find that very troubling from, you know, a variety of perspectives, but partially because, you know, I don't think that a failure to be able to conform in this way is in any way indicative of whether or not you're actually flourishing as a successful human being. So I guess I take the same starting point of like destigmatization, but I just have a different ending point of where I think that it should go.
I mean, I think reproductive ethics and politics are on folks' minds, and very much should be. And so I mentioned earlier work that I did at the intersection of assisted reproductive technologies and race and disability. And as I kept coming back to discussions of reproductive justice, I took a new direction in research that really looks at the relationship between racial slavery, reproductive oppression, and reparations. And so having had to engage with the theory of reproductive justice, which is invested in an intersectional and historical approach to reproductive politics today, you know, you see how the critique of a very narrow focus on abortion rights, which are often in the interests of white and wealthy women, can be reframed, importantly, to instead center the reproductive oppression of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So, for folks who might not be too familiar with reproductive justice, it's really animated by the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and very importantly, the right to raise children in safe, secure, healthy environments. So it's very much interested in social, environmental context. And what stood out to me initially in my research on reproductive justice was a lack of explicit attention to and engagement with the ethics of repair, at least in language structuring the key tenets of the movement. So I was finding things like reparations, compensation, corrective justice, and related terms weren't made a central concern theoretically. They didn't show up in the index in some of the key texts of the movement, which I found somewhat surprising because the movement itself is very much invested in infrastructural changes. So economic stability, healthcare, childcare, arenas in which wouldn't necessarily be thought of as reproductive rights matters, but under the frame of reproductive justice are central. We're talking about being able to have children, not have children, make these choices in supportive environments, and then also to make the choice to parent in safe and secure environments. So to me, if reproductive justice is about building structures of support for meaningful choice and freedom in reproduction, and if this is in response to an ongoing history of reproductive harm, which is made central in the key tenets, then I thought that a specifically reparative ethos was necessary. And so in one piece that should be coming out this year, I look at what's titled Reproductive Justice as Reparative Justice. And so I think about how we might infuse the language of repair into theorization on reproductive justice. How can we think of this long duration of racialized reproductive oppression and injustice as something for which repair is owed? How can we think about what I call reproductive reparations? Or how do we think about what's owed reproductively? These are questions that I engage in a few pieces. And so another piece looks specifically at US reparations for slavery platforms and challenges their lack of explicit attention to the harms of reproductive oppression from slavery onward. So whereas the first piece, I'm looking more specifically at reproductive justice analyses and conceptual framing. In the second piece, I look more towards reparative platforms, particularly for reparations for slavery in the US. And so my motivating question here is really, how can we even talk about reparation or the harms of slavery and colonialism without talking about reproduction and reproductive harm? And there's a great mass of literature, thankfully, that outlines the reproductive violences of slavery, racialized slavery in particular. It's reached this culminating point where I think we need to think seriously about reproduction much more holistically, with particularly a race and disability justice framework. And we need to really advocate and say these are harms that have been levied against populations by the state. And we can look at policy to make those claims. We can look at institutions. We can look at healthcare, history of medicine, gynecology, et cetera. And we need to think about how we can use a reparative approach to build a different world. So I draw a lot on Olufemi Taiwo's work from Reconsidering Reparations. And he's really invested in an approach to reparations that is world building rather than merely fixing. We're not interested in just a snapshot view of statistics at this moment, but we're looking at the the long history and the sedimentation of that history, right? The compounding, the accumulative nature of reproductive harm and violences. And it's a hard thing to grapple with and to think about, especially because it's it has intergenerational effects very clearly, right? So, for example, even if we solved racism tomorrow, right? Racism is solved, we have better institutions, etc. The effects of embodied racism can and will still continue on in offspring based on, epigenetic effects of the social stressors and physiological stressors of racism itself. So we need to think about our response, I think, reparatively to that fact that even if we solved racism in a way that we think it means to solve racism, we need to think about the embodied effects, the intergenerational effects, particularly at the locus of racialization and reproduction.
I'm really interested in kind of extraordinary experiences that people have. And extraordinary experiences could be anything like, sometimes they're called near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, but also experiences people have where they see and communicate with some type of perceived non-human intelligence is something that's very interesting to me. And these types of experiences, especially where you have, some type of communication, have been very heavily pathologized in our society. And, they're deemed as a, some type of mental illness, some type of hallucination, but they just can't, the argument is just that they can't possibly be real. And so I'm really interested in taking these stories and kind of looking at them through the phenomenological method and this idea of like what has appeared, and also comparing some of these experiences to things that people all around the world have reported for centuries. Okay, for centuries, people all over the world have had reported contact with all kinds of beings. And it's really just in modern Western medicalized, scientized society that we've said, this can't possibly be the case. You must be hallucinating. You must be, it can't possibly be real in any meaningful way. And so I'm also, starting a project right now. I'm kind of in the beginning stages, but of looking at these experiences through the lens of existentialism, of phenomenology, but also through the lens of just a Native American experiential metaphysics, right? This idea of looking at what's appeared in its context and in its place, and getting a more robust understanding of that as a lived experience with, perhaps biological, but also social, cultural factors, rather than trying to pathologize it. A lot of people who have had these experiences their whole lives tell the story of being told over and over by, a psychiatrist that they're crazy, that they're sick, that they, multiple trips in and out of a mental hospital because of, these experiences, and, coming to a conclusion very later in their life that, that shouldn't have been the approach to it. And that's, a real problem. And it's something that I don't think even, in philosophical discourse, people are saying that much about. And I think it's really important. And so that's something that I'm going to be doing more of in the near future.
I really, as you talk about this direction that you're going in, it really is such an extension of what philosophers tend to do, which is like really think about different ways of understanding what counts as evidence,
right?
What counts as testimony, right? So like when people talk about their own lived experience, you think about, I think about like an analogy with that is like people who experience chronic pain.
Right.
The philosopher's dilemma has always been is how can we validate the knowledge that is fully subjective, right? How do you validate that? And for disabled people or people who experience chronic pain, it's always been the problem of trying to provide the evidence, right? And the gatekeeping that goes on with like who gets access to pain care, then who gets treated as a credible witness to their own experience, credible knower. And this too is, I think, what it makes this kind of research so attractive, and to some degree a little taboo, because people don't think that this has philosophical richness. I think it's always assumed that there's a kind of like either it's true or it's not true. And it feels like almost like old-fashioned Cartesian,
Absolutely.
suspicion is that you have a mind and you have a body, and the twain shall not meet except through clear and distinct ideas, right? So I'll put a little Descartes primer in the Cartesian mind-body dualism. And I think also one of the other ways I see that lack of curiosity about these kinds of things, genuine philosophical, and deeply, committed curiosity, really wanting to know, it has to do with the mind-body dualism. Like, I think a lot of our society is mind over matter. It sneaks in everywhere. And I think the more we have not allowed ourselves freedom from those constraints, the more we haven't been able to enjoy the work of listening or attending or, giving credibility to knowledge or experience that people have as they self-narrate, as they self-report. And I think in the disability community, the ability to self-report in a way that is received as it is reported, nothing about us without us, I think is at the heart of what makes you curious and what drives your interest, your research agenda. But also, I say that with great admiration, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you're doing with this, because I find it exciting. I find it really, to kind of look in places for things, but also with the attempt to do what we do best, which is to provide new language, to provide new toolkits, things that might open up new conversations, and again, break away from, like you said, even if our starting point might be the same, that we are able to kind of find a different endpoint and open up new pathways of approaching these, so that it becomes humanizing, humane in the way we talk about what people self-report as their lived experience in the most ordinary ways and with language that fails them, right? But I really do love, and the other part of this, I think too, when I'm thinking about the nature of evidence, it really is important that we are stewards, right, in some ways, for the knowledge that gets generated from the work that we do. And I think that's also what I love about your work, is that you are a steward. So whether it be pop culture or not, I think you are stewarding the idea that there's treasure to be found in all kinds of places that very often get dismissed as somebody's junk, and I think that's also a really, you have to be keeping yourself well nourished intellectually to do that kind of work too, because sometimes that work does feel, I said this to my other colleague in one of the podcasts, when we do scholarship, we're either teaching to the void or we're writing to the void. We don't know who's on the other side. So I'll end with, let me know, what are you reading? What are you thinking about? What authors are you gravitating toward? What's giving you joy right now? What's keeping you nourished? And, anything you can recommend to people that they might want to also look into or think about.
So, I will make one comment about what you said about Cartesian dualism, because it is a huge problem. And I actually wrote a blog post about a year ago about, it was called Cartesian dualism and being in between, because a lot of these encounters that I'm talking about, these extraordinary experiences, they seem to actually emerge from some type of situation that's partially physical, but also partially not. And kind of like this intersection between the spiritual or mental and the material, in a way that in Western society, we just simply say can't happen, because we are so deeply entrenched in this Cartesian dualism that, if there is any type of spiritual realm or, realm of the conscious, it's completely separate from what goes on here physically. And there is this obsession with physical evidence. The only type of evidence that matters is evidence that comes through the five senses. I do think we have six, but the five senses, and what can be verified, under controlled conditions through the scientific method. And a lot of these experiences, they're called extraordinary because they can't be viewed through that lens. They don't confine to being studied by the scientific method. And so they're the only, if you're committed to, the scientific method as the only way of producing knowledge and truth, then your only option is to dismiss them because they don't conform to being studyable through that lens. And I'm also working right now on a blog post actually about reliable knowers. This very, credible knowers, because people who report these types of experiences are kind of, just immediately dismissed as obvious unreliable knowers. Obviously didn't see what they think that they saw. And then there's this additional layer to it that anybody who takes these experiences seriously and says, hey, there's something important here to look at, is also then kind of categorized as an unreliable knower because they're a believer then or something like that. And so they're also, excluded from, they've been said to have lost their objectivity or something like that.
I have to borrow that blog post about being in between because I'm giving a talk for the palliative care conference. And that's exactly the issue I'm going to have when I'm talking about this idea of caretaking and grief, because they are that in-between state of like caring for someone, but they're also grieving them at the end of their life or in that palliative care setting. And there really is that crisis of like not really having, having that physical person there, but still grieving them as if they're not, and how that doesn't count, or it does count, especially as a perception.
All right, so I actually have a book sitting right in front of me that I will recommend. It's called The Supernatural, Why the Unexplained is Real. And it's co-written with Rice University religion professor Jeffrey Kripal, and then also with Whitley Strieber. They write it together. Sometimes this field is really criticized because they're like, oh, it's like tinfoil hat people who are doing all of the writing. And one of Kripal's points is like, well, part of that is because you've made this an unrespectable topic of academic discourse, so there's no serious research that gets done on it, because when people try to write on it, they get dismissed in various ways. And so he introduced the Rice Archives of the Impossible, where there's going to be a lot of there already are there, but there's a lot of accounts of like these types of experiences, notes. Some of them are letters that were sent to Strieber after he published his book from people around the world, kind of just this collection of, anomalous phenomena, extraordinary things that people have experienced that we have no explanation for, and that are just kind of sitting there as things that scientists don't really want to touch because they don't know what to do with them. And a lot of academic people don't want to touch because there's a stigma with looking at them. And he's saying, hey, we need to look at this. It's really important. They're very important, and we need to do meaningful scholarship on it. And so, that exact point that we were talking about, he has a whole chapter in here about Cartesian dualism and how in Western society that kind of conditions the ways that we look at everything. And he's talking about it again in the context of these extraordinary encounters. But I think it would be, if you're just interested in that, in that problem of dualistic thinking that we have in our society, like this is a really good book for that. So I would also recommend, Anzaldúa, Borderlands obviously is her most famous. That's a really good text to read. Viola Cordova has done some excellent work in Native American indigenous philosophy. That's extremely interesting and exciting and important. I'm trying to think anything else that I'm recommending you to read. If you're more interested in anomalous experiences, I know this is deviating a little bit from bioethics, but it is tangentially related. The work of John E. Mack. He was a psychiatrist, but his work is very philosophical. And so I'm very heavily influenced by a lot of his work when I'm doing the work on extraordinary encounters.
I keep thinking, and you say it's tangentially related, but again, for me,
in saying disability bioethics is the future of bioethics, I think these questions are much more important as speculative questions about the idea of other life forms, of the idea of even the extraterrestrial, the non-terrestrial. Again, what happens when we find, Mars has, bioorganisms, and it turns out, what does infection mean? What is, we're going to have really rigorous, radical questions in bioethics if, as we keep exploring beyond our own boundaries currently, the future of bioethics has to be ready to be able to talk about what alternative experience. If you know anything about pop culture and science fiction, we've been dealing for a very long time with that question of what to do with the alien, right? What is not of a terrestrial. So there's lots of good. I want to recommend The Expanse. I loved that series. I haven't read it. I watched the TV version, but with stuff like that, that's where I do think there is overlap. It gives us the power to take what we might think is a given in our ordinary experience currently and think futurally. Think futurally outside the boundaries of what counts as life, what counts as related to the human, or what counts as human even, what is deserving of moral consideration, all really important bioethical questions. If we think futurally, I think there's very much what you're doing is you're ahead of the curve, if anything, not tangential. We're going to have to keep up with you, because I think what you're resourcing is something that belongs to a history of thought with Gloria will do it, and then moving it forward into these kinds of terrains of the archive. And again, how Foucauldian is that? Because that's what Foucault does, right? Foucault breaks with the concept of normal by resourcing the archive, and the archive becomes a place in which, as we go back and draw from it differently with different lenses and different approaches, we find new ways in which connections are there. They were kind of latent and just not something that people were looking for or new to observe. So that mandate that you have about giving good academic analysis to that archive that's being built is, I think, very much still in the spirit of a quality, future thinking bioethics that includes and breaks with a lot of the ableist connotations that is currently dominating the field.
The first one is a little bit more, well, yeah, I don't need to qualify. The first thing that comes to mind is I was very grateful to receive this grant from the Greenwall Foundation, which is a bioethics foundation. They cover 50% of my time for 3 years to work on a research project that's, now what did I call it? I called it Addressing the Roots of Disability Health Disparities. And it's a conceptual and normative analysis that's, here's the setup. We've got over 30 years of research showing that people with disabilities, including significant disabilities, have similar levels of quality of life to comparatively able-bodied people. No one, and I mean no one, seems to appreciate this point. Doctors keep not realizing it's true. Public health officials keep not realizing it's true. And no one has come up with an explanation for why it's this counterintuitive finding pops up over and over again. And the hypothesis of my project is to say, hey, maybe the problem here isn't merely how we're conceptualizing quality of life. Maybe the problem isn't judgments and biases. Maybe it's just conceptual. Maybe it's how the concept of disability is being deployed. Namely, it's being deployed in a too general manner. It's not fine-grained enough. And that's why these results are so confounding, including confounding to people who have a progressive, accurate understanding of disability. So I'm very excited to do that work, which will require me to kind of turn into a little bit of a qualitative sociologist, but I want to find out the answer to this problem. And I don't know it yet, and we will see what comes out of this. So that's very exciting. The second thing that is giving me a lot of life is I've got a paper. It's a revise and resubmit right now with my dear, brilliant colleague, Shelby Meissner. Works on indigenous philosophy, epistemology, language reclamation, lots of different things. And we're realizing this is going to end up being a multi-paper project that's thinking about coalitions for Indigenous futures, Indigenous and disability just futures. Something like that. I did the wording a little bit wrong, but that's okay. And we're now already starting to think through our second piece and bringing in a few other people on the team who have slightly different expertise with regards to not simply Indigenous studies, but a person who's working primarily in environmental bioethics and the environmental humanities, and the kind of synergy between the very exciting synergy I'm feeling between thinking about a future that takes Indigenous, not simply ways of thinking about the world, but Indigenous values and Indigenous senses of justice, bringing that into conversation with disability justice, bringing that into conversation with environmental justice. It's just a really, really exciting project. You know, I don't have the tools to do that on my own. And this group that I'm working with has just been, you know, we're already in the early stages, but it's already been really mind-blowing to me and generative. And I just feel very grateful to be a part of that team. So that's very exciting.
I just put up a possible paper on the idea that, birth privilege is white privilege, that this idea of like who gets to give birth and who has children and who gets to enjoy that, which is intimately tied with questions of disability, the fear of a, future with or without disability, what does that look like? A lot of that is also in the reproductive politics and reproductive, philosophies of reproduction. And, but I keep coming back to this idea that a lot of the discourses, the dominant discourses, the imaginary is attached intimately to white supremacy, and unpacking that and doing that kind of labor too is something that excites me as well. So what's giving you life in our last few minutes? What's exciting you? What are you doing that's bringing you joy? Because ethicists can be the Debbie Downers of our industry, of the kind of work we do.
I mean, academically, what's giving me life? Like, it sounds weird to be like, yeah, I'm reading about these great new approaches to thinking about eugenics, but it is true.
Okay, listen, to give credit to some of us, that does sometimes make us very happy.
Yeah, I mean, just furthering the dialogue along and trying to like get over impasses is important. So that is exciting. And so I will say that one work that I've recently come across was Kiara Bridges' The Dysgenic State. And
oh, is that new?
It's very new because
okay. So
I've been working on this stuff.
Reproducing Race, Kiara Bridges, Reproducing Race, and the new text. Those are editorial notes. Good, thank you.
Right. So this is a 2022 piece that came out. And here she's looking at the intersections of race and the production, the sociopolitical production of disablement or impairment. What is the impact on these racialized populations who are firstly subjected to environmental toxins at disproportionate rates that affect fertility, and then potentially forced to give birth to children who might have impairments or need support amidst dwindling supports, right? So it's this state-sponsored production or concentration of impairment in populations, like literally, in ways that I think that trouble particularly, or that trouble our historical understanding of eugenic narratives, but as she shows, really is complementary. So really she's thinking about how the racial effects of the dysgenic state, so a concentration of impairment in racialized communities, aligns with the motivations and the effects of the eugenic state, so the purging of impairment from or purification of white communities. So these are related, and we need to understand their relation. And when we do understand this relation, we are able to link histories of state-supported racialized reproductive oppression across time and throughout its varying political, medical, and scientific measures. But it's important to make and to very carefully understand that we need to both critique state-sponsored and supported infliction or production of disablement, while also saying that we need supports for disabled folks more broadly in society. We need to value disabled life and living. And to say that these two pieces are not contradictory, they're actually very much in line with justice. I've also done work on the concept of access intimacy, and that work is really inspiring to me to think about those practices of world building in relation to an ethos of repair that I discussed earlier. But just, I want to think about the social, political, relational tools we have at hand to make the world we want in our present. And access intimacy for me has been a key term that's inspired that. And that's from Mia Mingus, who writes on their blog about access intimacy really as, I think, a feeling, a practice, and a politic. But in terms of a feeling, it's when someone genuinely gets another person's access needs, and they don't have to feel like they are an afterthought or charity case or something like that, but that the relation between the two parties is one in which one's access needs are anticipated. They're prepared for, and that's part of the relation between those individuals, the relation of access intimacy. And this can be again, like a feeling. So it's just about the feeling of having one's needs just be understood. But it could be a practice as well, just acting in a certain way that accounts for thinking about other people's needs, other people's access needs. And then really thirdly, thinking about it as a politics, as a way in which we could radically reshape our world, right? What would it mean to think about access in this really robust, rich sense, rather than just accommodation, wherein we're just checking off boxes, or that we have a compliance checklist? That doesn't do much by way of radically transforming relationships and values and ideas surrounding disabled life and living. So I hope to return to that work in the near future and really link it up with some of these other structural justice frameworks that I've been thinking about. So reproductive justice, reparative justice. How can we think about access intimacy as this tool or concept that helps us perform justice in certain ways, right? And do it better and make more meaningful contributions to everyday life and living.
I hope you found our conversation enriching. I want to pause to acknowledge that Malloy University is located on the lands once home to Indigenous peoples, including the Lenape, the Montaukett Indian Nation, and Indigenous peoples who resided in the Massapequa, Merrick, and Rockaway territories. We recognize the long and complex history that has brought us to these lands, and we seek to understand the ongoing impact of settler colonialism and its influence on the cultures and heritages of Indigenous peoples. We remember and acknowledge our connections to Indigenous peoples and appreciate the opportunity to live and learn on this land. We honor the Indigenous peoples of the past, today, and in generations to come. I would also like to thank my guests today, Sarah and Kavita, and our student production interns, Jenna Tarini, Natalie Peralta, our student editorial interns, Kyle Aramiskis and Joe Maffetone. Much thanks goes to Kim Geary, and Liz Mandracchia for their administrative and promotional support of the podcast, and the Office of the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and the faculty of the Philosophy Department at Malloy. I appreciate all of the help and assistance. For any questions or concerns or comments or ideas for future podcasts, please email us at csec@malloy.edu. Thanks again for joining us.